welcome back to Coaching with the Bible. This week, Behaalotecha, the third portion in the book of Numbers, in the book of Bamidbar. And our topic this week is humility. When we read any books, or any articles, or listen to any talks about leadership, inevitably that conversation comes to the subject of humility. In a course I took over the summer last year as a coaching course by one of the great coaches in the world named Marshall Goldsmith. So one of the key ingredients in that conversation, in that course, in that learning, was about the fundamentals of great leadership. And at the core of great leadership are three values. One is courage, two is discipline, and the third is humility. And it's humility that we rarely ever talk about, nor learn about, nor practice, nor is it something that we necessarily think is part of what makes a great leader. Even though we know that the greatest leader of all time, Moses, is also known as the most humble person of all time. And so humility is not something that we coach necessarily to children when they're playing in a sport or doing anything, they're trying to accomplish anything. We don't necessarily think about humility as the way to go. It's certainly not in vogue in the world today to be a humble person. Right, we even have a concept that exists fairly newish called the humble brag, where someone's trying to be humble, but really they're bragging, and they're trying to brag in sort of a humble manner. You see those a lot on social media. And so humility as a concept is super important. It's not too complex per se to understand what exactly it is, but it is important that we get the context of it. And then develop not just an attitude of humility, but a practice of humility. It's something that I haven't sort of reinforced or talked a lot about, is the idea that not just that we should be thinking about these things, that we should have an attitude about this stuff. When we talked earlier on about an attitude of gratitude, we really need to have a practice of these different things, practice and gratitude. And it's not something we necessarily announce either when we're talking about our humility or trying to be more humble. We're not going to say, hey, I'm going to go now because I got to go practice being humble. It sounds sort of arrogant to say that, but it is something that we have to think about. And so the Bible tells us the story this week where for the first time the term humble and humility is mentioned in the Bible, even though we've had many instances of humility already. But the moment here is Aaron and Miriam are actually speaking about Moses. And they're speaking about him in what appears to be a derogatory and negative manner. And God stands up for Moses. There's no other way to describe that, but God stands up for Moses. And right before God stands up for Moses, the Bible tells us, and Moses is the most humble person on the face of the earth. So it seems sort of out of context to sort of say that there. And so how do we understand that? How do we understand that sense of humility there specifically? And how does that fit into the sort of the larger story? And then God goes and explains to Aaron and Miriam, do you not see the difference between the manner in which I speak to him and the way I speak to you? Do you not see the difference in the level of prophecy, the level of holiness, the level of connection that I have with him that I do not have with you? And then, as we know, Miriam is punished on the spot with leprosy. And then Moses prays for her, and she is then healed. So that's the story here. But it happens to be that in this portion, there's another moment of humility on the part of Moses when there are other prophets offering prophecy in the camp. And it appears to be that Joshua wants them to either be detained or destroyed. Their names are Eldad and Medad. Moses is a little bit hesitant and reticent to do anything of that nature. His reaction is basically, would it be the case? Would it be so bad if all of the people were prophets? And the commentaries there go deeper also there on this concept of Moses sort of being self-effacing and unwilling to sort of, take any of that personally in any way. But beyond that, if one steps back into the book of Genesis, you'll see other examples of people being humble. Abraham, in the conversation with God in his attempt to save the people of Sodom, says that he is basically dust of the earth, realizing sort of his role or his place in the world vis-a-vis God. Jacob later on talks about the idea that he is diminished in his own eyes because of all of the great things that God has done for him, sort of undeserving of all of the good that God has given him. Sort of a humble moment for him. He doesn't necessarily feel that he's deserving of that. And so you'll see other examples of it. The Bible doesn't actually tell us how Moses develops this humility, and certainly not directly. We could sort of infer it indirectly through different experiences and different moments. Certainly the beginning of Moses' career as the leader of the people in his attempt to get them out of Egypt were humbling moments. That first encounter with Pharaoh doesn't go so well. His first encounter with the people also doesn't go so well. That's at the beginning of the book of Exodus. It's not a great thing. Moses is chased out of Egypt, or he has to run into exile. He spends a long period of time in exile. Those can be humbling moments. If you sort of think about it in context, he is a prince of the house of Egypt. He then goes out to try to help his brothers. He kills the Egyptian. He's now wanted for murder, and now he has to go into exile, and he goes off ultimately to the tent of Jethro, and is viewed there as an Egyptian. And so maybe over the course of time it has steeled in him, but we sort of have to first understand, what does it exactly mean to be humble, and then to sort of be the most humble person in the world? If we think purely that the idea of being humble is to think of ourselves as low, so then it's hard. So then Moses thought of himself as the lowest person in the world. Then we have to sort of strive to be, or to think of ourselves even lower than Moses. How do we even do that? It's very hard to sort of see that in context. And there are sources that explain it that way. And it's also very hard then to sort of bring that into the world. And so I think the core message, or the core idea of what humility is brought actually from a secular source, from C.S. Lewis, and then it's quoted in the name of other people, which is this: humility does not mean you think less of yourself. It means you think of yourself less. I'll say that one again because I love quotes like this. Humility does not mean you think less of yourself. It means you think of yourself less. It doesn't sort of approach the idea that you're diminishing who you are as a person. It's you're diminishing the amount of time you spend thinking about yourself as a person, or the amount of time you spend thinking about yourself and your accomplishments. It's more of, as Rabbi Norman Lamb described in a sermon that he gave in 1963, and I want to give a shout out to Rabbi Jonathan Ziering, who discussed this sermon. I listened to it earlier in the week. It's a sermon from 1963 where Rabbi Lamb goes into greater depth on the conversation of what does it actually mean to be humble. And he quotes from another source, from the Netziv, which is another great commentary on the Bible, called Ha'emek Davar, from, I believe it's the, doesn't matter exactly when. But the idea here does not mean classically humility and thinking of ourselves as low, but it's more the sense of thinking ourselves in sort of a meekness more so. It's sort of an idea of, rather than thinking of ourselves, and I'll quote from Rabbi Lamb's work, rather a lack of arrogance and a lack of insistence upon honor. We are not focused on our honor, and it's not coming from any sort of arrogance. It is, as he says, to be a humble person means to recognize your true worth, but not to impose the consequences upon your friends and neighbors. It means to appreciate your own talents, neither overemphasizing nor underselling them, but at the same time refraining from making others aware of your splendid virtues at all times. Humility means not to demand that people bow and scrape before you because of your talents, abilities, and achievements. Humility means to recognize your gifts just as that, gifts granted to you by a merciful God, and which possibly you do not deserve. The idea here of humility is, as other sources, and here there are many books of ethics written that talk about the concept of humility and being humble, certainly in comparison or juxtaposition to being arrogant. The idea of really considering a person's space in the world and the gifts and the goodness that are granted to them, and considering that perhaps they don't deserve any of those things, or that those things are bigger, or that they haven't accomplished enough to maybe warrant some of those things, forcing ourselves to think about doing and accomplishing more. And so what the Bible is telling us here is that not that Moses thought low of himself, it's just that Moses never actually thought about himself at all. And so that when his sister and brother were speaking negatively about him, it sort of just washed off of him and deflected off of him. It didn't even affect him in the least, to the degree and to the point by which he was able to easily pray for her and pray earnestly and honestly and sincerely for her recovery. And so humility is this a very powerful, very, very powerful concept, certainly in the religious community. And religious communities do speak a lot about concepts of humility, but business communities don't. But they should, because again, all the literature points to the fact that the keys to great leadership are courage, humility, and discipline. Humility is part of that. Any of the leadership studies that one might read go into the idea that humility is part of what that is. And even in hiring practices, there's a hiring practice that I borrowed from Patrick Lencioni. Patrick Lencioni is the author of The 5 Dysfunctions of a Team and many other books. But he has a hiring practice wherein when he's interviewing people, he's looking for 3 things: hungry, humble, and smart. Hungry, humble, and smart. So someone who's hungry, someone's going to willing to go, someone's going to try hard, someone who's going to really go after it, someone who's really smart, they really appreciate what's going on intellectually, they really can connect the dots and really understand and make things really clear for other people. And then the third one is humble. Humble is this notion of coming into a position, coming into a situation, as Marshall Goldsmith explains in his work on the subject, coming into and appreciating that I don't know everything, that I'm not perfect, that there are other people here who know more than me, there are people I can learn from, there are things I need to know to be able to do and to accomplish and to succeed. That's all part of humility. And so we need to incorporate this into our working world, into our home lives, about being humble, to walk humbly, to not think low of ourselves. We want people to have a good sense of self-value and self-worth and accomplishment, and appreciate their accomplishments and be proud of doing great things. But also appreciate the role that other people play in those accomplishments, the idea that it's not just us, the idea that there are teams, that there are circumstances, sometimes there's even luck. And that also helps us have a more grounded approach. In another book that I mentioned multiple times earlier on in Coaching with the Bible, The $1 Trillion Coach, the story of Bill Campbell, who was an executive coach in Silicon Valley for many, many years. So when he talks about the people he's looking for, the people who are coachable, that's a term he liked to use. Do they have coachability? So he's looking for people who are humble. And humble is that sense that I'm not everything, that I don't have everything. And it's also with respect to leadership, it's a term that we hear a lot. It's called servant leadership. The reality that companies perform better when the leaders are operating from a mindset of service, that they don't own every opportunity in the sense that they don't have to do certain things, that they don't have to work for their other people on their team. But when you talk to leaders and CEOs and founders of small, medium, large companies, whatever they may be, you appreciate that much of the time they're doing is in the service of their team, in the service of their talent, so that their talent can succeed at a higher level. And so that is humility. That is humble. I actually saw in a book the following sort of cute anecdote. I'll tell it to you the way it's sort of written, so I think it makes a lot more sense. Because what often is the case is that we sort of understand this, but let's sort of see it in action. So here's the story. During the American Revolution, I'm quoting from a book called In Pursuit of Leadership, which I've quoted before as well. A man in civilian clothes rode past a group of soldiers repairing a defensive barrier. Their leader was barking out instructions but made no other attempt to help them. When the rider asked why, the leader said with great dignity, "Sir, I am a corporal." The stranger apologized, dismounted, and began to help the exhausted soldiers. When the task was complete, he turned to the corporal and said, "If you need some more help, son, let me know." With that, the commander-in-chief, General George Washington, remounted his horse and rode on. Because it's service. It's providing for other people. It's not thinking of yourself too high to be able to do anything. So then how do we do this? How do we practice humility? So one of the keys to being able to practice humility is to being willing and able and open, one, to accept criticism, to accept critique, to allow that I am not perfect, and to allow that what other people have to say that is there meant to help me become better, and then to work based on that. So that's step number one. Step number two is to have people in place, specifically people who you trust implicitly, who can tell you those things. It's not that they're trying to put you down, as they're actually trying to help you. But it does help you sort of stay focused in the moment, to stay appreciative of what's there. The third thing, and this is something we mentioned before, is humility requires thought. And building up a repository of humility and becoming a more humble person requires active thought in mode, meaning that in advance of doing anything, one is thinking about how they can do this in service of others and in the service of the success, but also coming from a place of humility. It is often said that anything can be accomplished in the world if we're willing never to take credit for it. That comes from a place of humility. The goal is the bigger prize. The team succeeding is the bigger deal. And so it takes a very intentional and mindful approach to those moments before you go into them. And then also, very importantly, afterward. When the success happens, to not simply just have this, moment of excessive hubris and pride and, backslapping yourself and humble bragging all over social media, but more in the sense of appreciating what was accomplished, appreciating the role of everyone who made that happen, and appreciating how beautiful it is that such a thing could actually get accomplished. So there's like an active way to sort of go about this in trying to build humility. It's not something we announce. It's not something that we put out there, but it is something that we should all work on, because the more we spend on it, the more we work towards becoming more humble, gives us the opportunity to actually accomplish more and to achieve more in the service of others, in the service of our families, and then actually in the service of ourselves. The more humble we are, the more human we become, the wider we can reach, and in the case of Moses, ultimately the impact we can actually have. So humility is this incredible thing. As one of the sources writes, it is the door to so many other great qualities. It is the opening to so many other opportunities when we approach things through a space and through a mindset of humility, like Moses and like the other leaders, like George Washington, the one that I mentioned before. Okay, that is Coaching Through the Bible for this week. A little longer than usual, but humility requires it and needs it, and we need to spend a lot more time on it, because we definitely do. We all need more of it. So let's work on becoming more humble. Let's be mindful, and let's pay attention, and let's focus, and let's appreciate what we have. Let's appreciate that there's so much more that we have to do and that we can do, and that is part of our humility. Okay, have a great weekend. Those celebrating, have a Shabbat Shalom.